Well, thanks very much. Coming to an academy of scientists and being an economist is always daunting, I have to admit, but I've tried to do my best. And what I thought I'd do is start off with an anecdote, very unscientific, but I think telling in its own way. We live in Winterthur. We have our office in Winterthur, a small town in Switzerland. And about 4 years ago, every day I would go to our window in our office in our conference room and look across the road, and there was a building coming up. It was a shopping mall, which has since been completed. But I used to watch it with great wonderment. And I used to watch it with wonderment because I would often count only 8 people of a stack of machinery, and it was being built on schedule and presumably under budget, knowing the Swiss. And at first I used to think, wow, this is amazing efficiency, 8 people. And then I suddenly was stopped in my tracks and said, what makes you think this? Why is it when we think of efficiency in economic terms, we think of less people and more machines? What is it that does that? And then I started thinking about property developers, who I think are about the lowest of the low in society. And I thought, wait a minute, this was at the time when property developers were getting subsidized credit, low-cost credit, financial capital was at its lowest. And Swiss wages were very high. But even more important, the take-home pay of a Swiss worker was only 1/3 of what the total cost of that worker was. In other words, there was taxes being paid on income to that person, and then there was massive taxes, about 80% added on to the cost of labor that the company had to pay. So wasn't it no wonder that there were only 8 people and a stock of machinery? And the machinery, of course, you could amortize and depreciate. And it started me thinking a little bit about, well, what would happen if you had the same budget and 80 people working there, or 800, but with the same budget? Wouldn't that be a better outcome? Wouldn't that have a multiplier effect? Couldn't it keep 792 people more employed and happier? And so I started thinking then that we have got to look at economics in a more holistic manner and not get little sound bites when we think we are being efficient, when we may be substituting one form of high-cost capital for another. And so I started going back to my economics textbooks. I had started studying economics at the age of 16 in England. With the standard books that we all had at that time, Samuelson and Lipsy and others. And there were lots of things about labour and capital. And at that time, the discussion was very much centred around the economics of about 150 years before then, which was, how do you look at labour compared with built capital? And how do you trade off the two? And you use 1 unit of labour will get you 1 unit of capital in terms of output, and the way you choose between the two is the relative price of each, of the price of a unit of labour and the price of a unit of capital. And that seems all very well, except if I go back to my Swiss example, and what we were doing was absolutely distorting the marketplace. We were making financial capital dirt cheap, which meant built capital was dirt cheap, and we were making labour very expensive. And yet intuitively, surely, with 300 million people unemployed, with 2 billion people underemployed in this world today, we have a lot of labour. Shouldn't we be doing the reverse? Shouldn't we be getting the system more in balance? So then I went back further and started thinking about Adam Smith. For those who are interested, Adam Smith is either, depending on your persuasion, a great British economist or a great Scottish economist. You can choose between the two. He is, on the £20 note, listed as a great British economist, but who knows, after the 18th of September, we may not see him with the Queen of England on the other side, we don't know. But either way, he was the father of economics. When you read Adam Smith, he was a moral philosopher. He asked the questions, what sort of society should we have? What sort of society do we need? And economics at that time was seen as nothing more than a simplistic means to an end. And I'd like to suggest to you that over the last 200 years, we've reversed that, and economics has become an end to a means. We've forgotten what the means is, or we think of economics as an end. And in doing so, we've given it an aura of Newtonian science that other than our physicist friends such as Ivo would reject immediately. But the truth is, it never was Newtonian science. It wasn't handed down in some sense. It's not immutable laws. It is the practical instrumentalities to achieve something. And when I started thinking of that, I had to then sort of think, well, what is the something that economics should be doing? I think also, as is on the £20 note, it reads quote, the division of labour in pin manufacturing and the great increase in the quantity of work that results. They didn't mean the quantity of jobs, they meant the output, by the way. And so I started also thinking about how economics has evolved. It's become highly specialised. We've got about 30 or 50 branches, from health economics, environmental economics, to monetary economics, to macro, etc., etc. And yet we've sort of lost sight of what it was all about in the first case. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about. What Adam Smith saw was there must be the betterment of the human condition. And economics, markets, industrial processes at the time of the Industrial Revolution are one part of how to make life better for people. And that, in some sense, is the underpinnings of what economics should be, and I'll come on to it where I think it's lost its way. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the theoretical constructs, but also the practical application. Yet at heart, the basic idea of economics comes from the Greek, from household. It's how to get the best out of the range of resources you have at your disposal, how to get the right mix of resources to produce the desired outcome that you as a society want. And that raises, I think, three types of questions. One, how do we set out what we want? Do we really understand what we want? And I'll come on to that later. How do we get the right mix of resources to meet that outcome? And is the future the same as today? Will we not see a dramatic change over the next 50 years that might question the kinds of economics we've applied today? Just as I would say the economics we're applying today is about 100 years out of date. It's making assumptions about limits or limitlessness of natural resources, for example, which was probably true 200 years ago. They didn't think about that. Nobody thought about the declining fish stocks. Nobody thought about even energy at that time because there was plenty of timber, etc. So is the future a good paradigm for us thinking about economics today? And is economics today the right economics compared with where it was 200 years ago? I think that's my first point, is that the world has become more complex in so many ways. Let me just list a few that I think have changed the paradigm or pushed the paradigm in new directions. The first is the one that Eva spoke about this morning, which is risk and uncertainty. We live in a much riskier world on so many fronts, and we are seeing the covariance of risks that are related to one another. So that a civil risk is an economic risk, is a health risk, is a social risk. I think that one thing we've lost sight of, and one thing the Club of Rome had a proud tradition of, and I suspect WAS also, is systems thinking. The notion of covariance within systems, so that an environmental issue is a health issue, is a social issue, it's an economic issue, it's a productivity issue. It's not simply a segmented issue. And we've moved, I think, away from systems thinking to the detriment of economics and to the detriment of public policy more generally. But in doing that and thinking about it, we also have to look at the world has integrated much more today than 150 years ago or whenever it was when Adam Smith was talking about it. Globalization is a fact of life. Multinationals are no longer now just the big old huge companies, the big corporates. The little shop down here is a multinational. I guarantee they buy a lot of their goods from China. They trade to maybe 20, 30 different nationalities today, people visiting. So we're in a much more of a global world than ever before. We've got much more labor mobility, but very, very importantly, we've got massive capital mobility. And that produces both systems questions, but it reinforces risks. When we think of how a small country like Greece could have disrupted totally a massive economic system, which it did. 11 million people could disrupt 250 million people. It's staggering that we've never planned a resilience and hedging strategy to think through how we manage risk and uncertainty in our new world. These were not issues that were ever thought of in Adam Smith's time, and they're really not issues that are confronted by our economic thinking today in many respects. Final one, I think, on the integration is that what is the unit of economy anymore? Certainly in Adam Smith's time, certainly when I was growing up and studying economics, it was the nation state. That was the sole largely the sole economic unit. You looked at comparative advantage on trade, but it was the nation state. The nation state is becoming less and less important. New alliances are being formed, new relationships are being formed. In the next number of years, in my view, your local community and your global community will be more important than your nationality and the passport you happen to have. Another change, I think, is when Smith, and indeed when I was being taught economics, and many of the economists of today are those who are living off those same teachings, there was capital meant built capital. That was the definition of capital, built capital, and we looked at labour and capital trade-offs, as I've mentioned. I think in today's world, we understand there are many forms of capital. Psychological capital, cultural capital, social capital was mentioned this morning, financial capital, ecological capital, environmental capital, and human capital. So instead of optimizing across the two axes, we now have potentially a 9-axis framework that we must optimize against and understand the trade-offs between the two. And that's a far more complex issue than we are used to confronting. And I think complexity is growing in this field. The next point I would say is that services have really largely replaced, or at least have become a very big part of the global economy and the national economies and local economies. We've shifted from just producing goods to producing goods and services. And services have grown dramatically. So when we had natural capital that was worthless because it was mountainous, is suddenly very valuable because it provides a service, tourism or whatever. When you had a useless coastline with a few rocks here, that was worthless 200 years ago, apart from its beauty, it's now worth enormous amount for tourism. So we're changing our mix of goods and services in a way that neither Smith could have predicted, nor indeed could the economists of the 50s and 60s, who were really the pioneers of the changing thinking about economics. Final one I would say, well, perhaps two, is the notion of the public good has risen dramatically. Not just the global public good, which is perhaps climate change is the best example, but there are many examples where the difference between the private good and the public good is much more blurred than ever before, and the spillover effects are more important. It's what I've often said is that the externality is bigger than the internality. The external effects of an action are often larger than the internal effects. The economic rate of return is more important than the financial rate of return. Finance just looks at market prices and looks at a return. But if you don't include all of the spillover effects, some can be positive, some can be negative, then you're missing the point of economics totally. And the externality, which when I was growing up and being taught economics was treated as a little bit of an add-on that didn't make much difference. In today's world, in the energy sector, for example, with a shadow carbon price, a carbon price that reflects the cost of society, the externality might actually be bigger than the internal rate of return. So I think there are a number of reasons why complexity has added dimensions to economics that make us rethink towards a more holistic view of economics, and in a funny way get us back to the basics, which is what do we want of society, and how can economics be one instrument, an important instrument, to achieving that. And so it leaves us with, in my view, three areas where I would say economics has really lost its way in that sense. The first is what Gary and I have spoken about before, the divorce between the economy and other dimensions that are important. One is employment in the economy. We are simply not creating the number of jobs we need or the amount of work we need for the people we have on planet Earth. Last year, the ILO published statistics which show that we were now at the highest number of people unemployed ever. We have underemployment in developing countries, which is probably approaching 1.5 to 2 billion people who do work occasionally, but basically don't earn a living wage. And we've lost sight of the fact that our economics should have been working towards ensuring full work, a world full of work for those who want it. Because work affects not only income, health status, poverty status, but it also is a powerful, the lack of work is a powerful impediment to creating social capital. The lowest social capital is often in the places where people are unemployed and don't see the possibility of employment. The second divorce was between ecology and economy. We mispriced nature. We mispriced our energy resources and our water resources by a massive amount. In today's world, just on financial subsidies alone, energy subsidies are about $370 billion. Water subsidies are probably larger. We're probably approaching $1 trillion of subsidies on two of our depletable resources, and we're not accounting for them, we're not measuring them, we're not valuing them correctly, and therefore it's no surprise that we're using them indiscriminately with a potentially a very high economic cost. 200 years ago, water was a free good. Energy was a free good, except you had to walk and chop a few trees down. It was essentially there. That world has changed, and we're understanding that our ecology, whether it's our climate, whether it's our land, whether it's our depleted resources in the seas, whether it's our agricultural land or our water resources, are a valuable economic commodity. I'll come back to why we need to rethink the value of that. We've also seen, I think, since about Reagan and Thatcher, and I think when the historians, the economic historians look back, they will see two great culprits in this world, Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, who forgot about the public good completely and made the case that the marketplace would provide everything. We lost sight of energy system planning. I used to be a power system planner at the World Bank. I did a lot of power system planning. We were suddenly told the Washington Consensus, you throw that out of the window, the market will do everything. As a result, we saw the explosion of the marketplace. We saw the creation of some of the most creative financial instruments known to humankind, which took money, sliced and diced it, moved it away from the banking system into an ether of the financial system. And we've seen a massive divorce, which I think will be very hard to stitch back together, between the financing and banking system on the one hand and the real economy on the other. There are many estimates of this, $4 trillion a day that's traded in currencies, $4 trillion a day. Not one dime of that goes into real investment, goes into the real economy. That means we are losing the potential for investment in jobs, in real productive assets, because we're treating money as a floating asset, but it's just money is begetting money. Money is making more money, but it's not actually being driven in many cases into the real economy. Whether you look at the credit derivatives that are floating around or the currency trades, they trade money, but what they don't do is add value added to our economy. So there's a lot of damage has been done to our economic system that will require us to take a deep breath, step back, and say, we need to restitch this. We need to pull this together and make it a whole. We need to make it bigger than its component parts. And I'll come on to what I think we can do about that. So I think there's three broad challenges. I think there's a challenge of concept, philosophy, and values. I think there's a challenge of methodology, and there's a challenge of implementation, how we do it. The first challenge, I think, is the one that we've talked about, and we've talked about a lot, which is, do we really understand what sort of world we want? Because if we don't have the values for the sort of world we want, we are not then going to put the economic instruments in to get it. And I think our values are going to be issues of intertemporal values, whether we care about future generations. I have my own views on that. I'm not sure we do. Our tolerance to risk. How tolerant are we? What are our values and our tolerance to risk? What is our relationship with nature? Are we a part of nature, or are we apart from nature? What is the right relationship, the values we have on nature? And how do we deal with the new globality? Do we believe we are global citizens, and therefore are we willing to put part of our responsibility onto the back of the global agenda, and not just on part of the local or national agenda? So I think we have a major debate about our values. It is my belief, for example, that one of the reasons we haven't got the kind of traction we want on climate change is that it's not clear to me that people value the long term. Some of us do, but it's a question I would put forward that our values may not be consistent with some of the things we claim we want to do on climate change. Are we willing to really put today's money for tomorrow's problems, today's money for tomorrow's generation? I think that's a big issue. So I think there's a challenge of this debate about concepts, philosophy, and what sort of world we want, what sort of society we want. There are challenges for methodology, and here I think the debate here for me is, should we move to a new theory of humanity which embraces economics as one element? I know there's been a debate in Moss about that, and that's certainly one approach. Or should we simply say, why don't we just start doing economics as it was supposed to be? Just go back to the basics and get economic costs and prices that reflect the real scarcity value, or the real value to society in the use of the resources, whether they be people, buildings, land, weather, ecology, or whatever it might be. And that we should never forget the basic principle that economics is to optimize the use of all of society's resources for the betterment of society, as I say, defined later. I think we need to think about how we think of value-adding wealth creation versus narrowly defined economic growth. It's not clear that economic growth is buying us all of the goods and services of real wealth creation that we need. I think we need to look at distributional consequences of goals. Some societies that would claim to be more stable, more secure, more predictable in their outcomes have been the societies where the ratio between the poorest and the richest is much narrower. What we've seen over the last 20 years is a massive widening of that. And so we have perhaps 1,000 ratios that used to be, I remember, I think it was Sweden and others set ratios that were 10 or 20 or so. We now see ratios that are 1,000. That the richest person in our country is 1,000 times more than the poorest. And that, I think, causes not only impacts on distributional questions, but it causes issues of social tension, and will do. I think we need to look at resilience and risk-adjusted growth. How do we look at growth from a risk perspective and not just from a purely constructivist kind of view where we're just going to get growth all the time? Our view is we want to get growth restarted, but don't we really want to get risk-adjusted wealth creation? And Herman Daly, who was a colleague of mine at the World Bank, still close to touch with him, he came up with ideas that we were, in many cases, approaching towards uneconomic growth, where the cost of getting a unit of growth was more expensive than the growth we got for it, if you priced everything correctly, if you priced out the real cost of labor, the real cost of natural capital. And let's never forget that built capital is 90% natural capital. It is the water, energy, sand, soil that goes into built capital. So when we build capital, we're also depleting natural capital. We sometimes forget that. So I think there's a question to my mind is whether we need a new theory of economics or whether we get back to the basics of adding in all the externalities and pricing and allocating those accordingly. Whether we want to manage monetary policy with a degree of prudence in line with the needs of the real economy, and whether we want to provide all of the opportunities we can to develop and utilize the human spirit, and whether we want to put blockages in the way of uneconomic growth. There, I think we need new institutions to do that. Let me turn to implementation finally. It seems to me that one of the biggest distortions we have is the one that I spoke about when I was looking at the Swiss building site. And that is, we want to create more jobs for all the reasons we've spoken about. So why do we tax the thing we want more of? When you tax things and you reprice it, demand normally drops. It's exactly what's happened. And why is it we want to subsidize the very things we treat as very valuable, natural resources? So at a minimum, we could easily start with a reconfiguration that could be tax neutral. You would still get the same revenue resources. But let's look at a level playing field between the real scarcity values of the forms of capital we have, natural capital, which is depleting very fast, faster than we can often believe, and human capital, which we're not repleting fast enough and is coming on the market faster than we can accommodate. So I would say there is scope for carefully thought policies that will really rechange our fiscal system, our tax system, to make the things that are scarce costly and the things that are not less costly. I would suggest 3 goals if I was the person involved in looking at societal goals and values: a full jobs economy with a social safety net where that perhaps falls through; ecological neutrality, where we hold constant the level of ecology we have, and perhaps with carbon elimination added to that perhaps over a 20 or 30 year period. And we would not throw out economic growth. There's a lot of people who are willing to say economic growth is bad. If you're part of the 2 billion people in this world who don't have enough income, believe you me, economic growth is a good thing. We cannot ignore that. But we could ask the question, what would an economy look like that was full of jobs, ecological neutrality, and carbon elimination over a 20 to 30 year period? What would an economy look like? Could we live with it? Would it represent a vision that we could embrace? I think that is one of the most important questions, and the answers would be probably more complex. But I do think we'd look at distributed power and decision making. I think we'd look at a higher savings of resources that are valuable and irreplaceable, natural capital, and the more and greater use of labour through new thinking about new business models, the performance economy being one of them, where we would look at how do you save capital and how do you use labour more effectively. I think we'd see the real price of consumer goods would represent their real use or their real cost to society, and we would look at shifting into high value adding public goods. We would invest massively in public goods. And I think we would look at a safe and more resilient, more predictable economy if that was the case. But I think there's a lot of work to do that. I think it's philosophical and conceptual, it's methodological, and I think if we only go in those 2 routes but don't provide some early answers to how we could start shifting our economy to make it better, we will miss the impact of the whole package. So I think there's much to do, and as Confucius once said, a great philosopher, that after enlightenment there's the laundry. Well, I think we've had enlightenment and now is the work in the laundry to do. So I think there's a lot to do in putting our new economic house in order. And I think the downside is that if we don't, we're going to struggle to meet the needs and aspirations of 2 or 3 billion people on planet Earth. And we're not even going to meet the aspirations and needs of people in the richer world, such as ourselves. I think it's a great challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian, very much for this excellent presentation. Now, of course, as always, this is open for comments primarily, questions. Krona?
First, thank you very much for the invitation to participate and thank you very much for the excellent talk. I just would like to, I didn't prepare for the talk, but let's say from my memory, which goes back, let's say at least 5 years ago when I was in the school in Yugoslavia, socialism. And the system was very simple when we took the lectures in, let's say, philosophy. And I remember that what was produced by Marx was strongly supported by economy of Adam Smith, if I remember, 2-3 Ricardo. Was the second name. I'm not expert, so perhaps I'm not wrong. But your excellent talk, it was also addressed by Marx and Marxists after all. What are the values? What is philosophy? What are the values? What is methodology? And I have, let's say, recognized many things in your talk. Obviously, today is this raffinement of economical terms, and that time didn't exist something like ecology, as you mentioned, so and so on. But relations was almost recognized, even today we recognize the same relations. And what was, let's say, philosophy of Marx, for me Marx is Marxist in general, not just Marx, but the shift in economy, not in economy as such, but the shift to human relations, the societal relations is much more important than economy as such. So I recognize in your talk something like that. And also, of course, the methodology, which was revolutionary, and we are aware of the fact that this system produced, after all, some religions, which, after all, most of them collapsed today, so it was wrong in some sense. But public goods and, let's say, understanding even of history of humankind in terms of directness, what was the Hegel, but in materialism, is, you know, they recognize something as, let's say, social, let's say, the law of how the society develops, as you mentioned Newton. So they believe strongly that they are on good track in the beginning. So, sorry about introduction. So I would like to ask you to make the comparison of, let's say, your ideas and how you talk, just compared to what used to be philosophical, economical socialism in terms of Marxism.
Hey, John, that's good. This because I was exactly to the point. You got an answer in your question. You mentioned Marx, Marxist, and you mentioned the movement toward neoclassical economy, which was thesis, anti-thesis, and this is what I am producing, is synthesis. Period. We are looking for good practices. We take a lot of tools. We are not able to implement. But we moved from one extreme, which was Marxism, to another one, to neoclassical economics. Now we are looking for a balance. Thank you for jumping for this.
Okay. I think, in a sense, we're looking for a third way. I mean, I think it's dangerous to get hooked into, is this Marxism revisited? Is it capitalism with a social face? I think it has to be seen as a new way forward. And I think there are changes. I mean, I think the notion of the public good is a much bigger concept today than even in Marx's time. I'm just reminded, just when you mentioned this, in the Irish economy, which went through, there was a very witty commentator on the Irish economy, said it had been heavily influenced by Marx, but it was Groucho, not Karl. No, I think there are serious, we can't lose history and lose sight of history, but I actually think we're looking for a third way, a new way forward. And the new way forward will entertain parts of the best of the market system and parts of the best of the public good system. And it's not either or, it's bringing it together. I think that's how we have to sell it as well, not as I don't like the notion of capitalism with the human face and that sort of stuff. I think it's a new paradigm, a new thinking. But it has elements of that.
Winston and then Sasha.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure I understand where you are now, but I thought in your presentation you thought we were having to face a choice, at least in our discourse, between going back to the market system with real costs and real needs, real demands, real supplies, and that the market could supply some inclusive level of rationality to meet the demands of our community. On the other hand, you said we haven't had to suppose against the possibility of the economy. My concern with the market is not that I don't like the market, is that I think there's always been a tension between the market and social forces. And to the extent that the market seeks to avoid the discourse about how it's influenced by factors of political and economic power, it assumes all the actors in rugby centers do not. In fact, it tends to distort the context within which it's operating while maintaining a pretense of neutrality. So, in my view, Marx is fair to say, look, you've got to look at economy from the standpoint also of power relations. Otherwise, you miss the boat, so to speak, and maybe that's what's been missing today. We see in the organization of global finance a subtle but important shift to the point of Wall Street, and nobody knows what they're doing, except the consequences have global implications. So I think probably that we are looking for a new paradigm that has to take into account a much richer and more sophisticated conception of the way power works in social relations globally.
Sasha?
Yes, yes. Yeah, do you agree with our colleague from academia, Jonathan Graham, who I met last meeting in Washington, D.C., last year actually? And he said that the problem with current paradigm is that it's based on ideological premise of progress. Very interesting.
Good.
Okay. Well, just to follow up on your comment, and thanks for having me here.
We enjoy it.
But I also, this was also my interpretation, that what you're actually saying is that let's go back to the basic of economics, and as a sociologist, I can hear that you want to maintain the market as probably the most important institution for allocating resources in the society by, for instance, having big prices, for instance, putting price on natural resources, right? So if I hear you correctly there, I guess I'm not an economist either, but there are tons of literature on problems related to public goods from a market point of view, because you have unforeseen consequences, you have free rider problems, etc., etc. So could you say something more about how can this be united? That's question number one. And number two is, how can you put the price on the priceless, like nature? I mean, you can put the price on things when there is a market for it. So oil, I come from Norway, we have oil and gas. Of course, that's natural resources, but they are limited, and we know, and there's a high price for that, right? Because it's limited. But if you have wind power, and perhaps you mentioned water as well, it's being recycled, and it's going to be extremely complicated to think of how we can sort of put price on these resources. But I think it's a good argument. But there's also been a long discussion on that. So please.
One just comment, please.
Yeah.
I used to live 45 years under central Atlantic economics, and observed 70 years of central Atlantic economy. So if you believe that central Atlantic economy made more damage to the environment than markets.
Yeah.
So this is what we need to be aware that the central Atlantic is not a panacea. I mean, the other day I was talking about different ways of coordination, and we should think about complexity and the complex system of managing our resources. We need to have market forces, but we need to have also the central intervention. We need to, because there are market failures, but also the governmental failures. Something what helps us to keep balance is the network, is the way of another coordination, which is flat, which is not hierarchical, which based not zero-sum game, but positive sum game, which will be the bridge, and type of buffer between both systems. So, when I came to the States 30 years ago from Central Atlantic economy, I was surprised that for public goods or collective goods, Minneapolis and Paul, 2 cities, plus, 20-something municipalities, they came together and they had 50 years paving plan, sewage plan, 50 years horizon. And it was not just wishful thinking, as we saw in this 5-year plan. Everything was with the financial mechanism, how it will be financed. So, you see that we have experience also with good planning for collective, for public good. The issue is that we move from one extreme to another extreme. This is why I was thinking about this synthesis. But in each case, we have the paradigm shift. We need to have new paradigm for this. It doesn't mean that, I say we need to have an eclectic stuff. It will be new quality and new paradigm. Thank you.
Let me try to answer it. I think, in some sense, we fall into a trap, or the very trap I talked about, which is when I spoke about prices and markets, I was not meaning those as an end, but a means. You have to define what the end is. And markets are good at some things, and they're not good at others. Markets can be adjusted to get what you want, or you can regulation, there are many ways of skinning that cat. You need to understand what the cat should look like. That is to say, we need to understand what sort of society we want. It's quite legitimate to say there are some things that the coastline of Norway is so important for today's generation and the next generations, we need to protect it. The question is, how do you protect it in the best way? What instruments do you use? And that's where you can at least look at the array of instruments and say, markets might play a role, regulations might play a role. There are many different ways of getting there, but we shouldn't fall into the trap that I think you did of thinking of markets and prices as the end. They are one means of getting there. Why do I talk about markets? Because we have to recognize markets are there for many goods and services. And the big problem we're now seeing is that market prices are not absorbing the external effects that they have. So we have one or two choices. We can pull them out of the market and use other mechanisms, regulations, or whatever. Or we can say we have to be clever and say the markets have to be regulated or taxed or whatever it might be. A good example is the Tobin tax, I think. It's a very good idea, not because it just raises lots of money that can be spent, but because of its behavioral impact on dampening speculation. That would be a sense of not saying you can't trade currencies anymore, only governments will do it, would be a mistake. But there are mechanisms by which you can get what you want. So I think the one answer is that you're absolutely right. You can't price everything, and you shouldn't. But you can. I mean, one fault I think I have, by talking about values and prices, I don't mean prices that then get thrown into the marketplace. I mean understanding what the economic cost or value of a good and service is, and then taking the appropriate action. A good example on that, by the way, is I think the evidence will show that a well-regulated electric utility is a far more efficient way of delivering electricity than the marketplace was. I mean, I think we will have seen massive price distortions and investment distortions in the electricity industry over the last 20 years because we moved from a regulated monopoly into an unregulated anarchy, in a way. So I think we've got to start with what we're trying to achieve and then look at the instruments to achieve it. I hope that makes some sense. I think it's answering both Winston and your concerns. On the ideological paradigm, I'm not sure quite what you have in mind on that.
He said something really interesting, that one of the arguments to change kind of paradigm is because it's based on ideological premise of progress, which sounds very interesting, something very interesting for me. Because if you are talking about progress or development, it has its ideological side, which is progress from one side. It could be far from progress from the other side. Let's say if you want to fight a kangaroo or to cope with kangaroo in Africa, you can put a GMO food there just to solve current problem. But on the long run, what we are causing. Is it progress or not in a way?
There's always the risks, and this is what I think we have to understand in our values. What about risk and the tolerance to risk? I'll give you a good example on the food one that I was involved in personally. There is something called golden rice, which is a genetically modified rice that essentially marries a daffodil to rice. I mean, I'm putting it crudely, but it brings vitamin A. And there was a major campaign in the Philippines against that. And it raised an interesting values question, because those who were campaigning were like us, and we had the money to take the risk that we wouldn't eat vitamin A enhanced rice, because we had the ability to do that. But if you were a 10-year-old kid sitting on the streets in Manila and you couldn't go to school because you had night blindness, your risk profile may be fundamentally different from ours. So we have to look at these questions as ones of values, and we have to look at our values with respect to risk and tolerance, which is one of the things I opened with. So those I think are some of the big intellectual, philosophical underpinnings of any new paradigm for humanity.
And if I can continue very short with this comment. Here is Carl, who can help me to translate the word in German. So Jakob von Uxkal, but not our colleague, but his grandfather, the biologist, he coined the word Umwelt, something like that. Umwelt, which we translated as environment. So environment means something around me. I'm not belonging to the environment, it's something around me. Umwelt means total harmony with the system. With the
It's the world around you.
It's also around you. So it's also an argument for changing the paradigm.
Well, don't forget what I said on the values. One of the big questions on values we have to debate is, are we a part of nature or apart from nature? And I think that's a fundamental debate that has to happen. And that will determine, do we colonize nature? Do we see ourselves as tolerant, or do we see ourselves as an integral part of it? And what are the consequences of that? So I agree. I think that again comes back to, once we know what we want, economics can help us get there. But if we don't know what we want, it may not. And what we don't want, I suspect, is the kinds of terrible distortions we have seen over the last 50
And
years.
you also mentioned something like, are we over or less developed in the context of evolution? That's also a question of our consciousness about nature and the way we are treated.
Okay, one thing that, of course, several of you raised the question of paradigm and the new paradigm. Few comments on that. Of course, the most recent one is World Academy of Art and Science, and now together with the Club of Rome, with the Club de Madrid, with a couple of other organizations, have already had one meeting, which was in Baku on April 30th. We'll have another one in Almaty now in November. We'll have the third one again in Baku, devoted to the question of the new paradigm. Okay. Now, go to a very simple thing. What is the paradigm? Paradigm is a word, I think, coined by Thomas Kuhn when he wrote actually the history of science. And there he was applying it basically to a very simple case, as I keep repeating and repeating here, physics. Okay? Physics is by far the simplest things that exist in the world because of a number of things. So what was the problem there? The problem there was that at the end of the 19th century, physics had it was actually the pinnacle of success. This was the period when Maxwell wrote his equation, unifying electricity, magnetism, and got light as a result of that. It was a great part of thermodynamics, where we understood the concept of energy. Everything was there, and there were two little clouds, as Maxwell wrote. And he said these clouds are irrelevant, except the clouds turn out to be theory of relativity and quantum physics. Okay? And this is called now really the paradigm change. What did the paradigm change imply? It implied that our concept that we consider to be common sense, like space, time, determinism, effect on the measurement, and so on, all of this had to be replaced. So it's a major thing, so major that George Bernard Shaw wrote and said, "You destroyed my dogma of infallibility. Now I don't know what is true, what is not. You have this stupid uncertainty principle. I don't want to live in uncertainty." And things like that, okay? Fine. So this is what was the big paradigm change. And then the use paradigm change became very, very frequent. So now you use the word paradigm change almost when you change your shirt, which is really a little bit ridiculous. Yeah. But now let us look at the world situation, socio-economic, political, now, and try to compare it to the situation in physics at the end of the 19th century. Kelvin more or less was right. I mean, most of the physicists were perfectly happy doing what they were doing. And those two little clouds were indeed two little clouds. They did not bother most of the physicists doing their work. Who cared about some two strange Americans doing an experiment that proved that there is something funny about life? Who cared about a couple of, spectra? This was part of physics. Now where we are now, our economy is, as we have seen, really in bad shape. We have destroyed terribly a natural capital. There is a book by the Club of Rome co-president, Anders Wickman, together with biologist Rekström. There was first an article in Nature, now there is a book, Bankrupting Nature, and we have seriously, influences a number of things. So this is bad. Then there is obviously a bad situation with, as Ian said, let's repeat it. Huge unemployment that we have, serious problems there, every now and then another economic crisis, and to make things even less pleasant, we have a huge stock of nuclear weapons that can destroy us in no time. Okay? And we don't know how to do this, and now remembering the World War I, and looking at the current situation, we really could sleepwalk into the World War III. And just as they sleepwalk into World War I. So this situation is dramatically different from what it was the situation in physics. We are really unhappy and have good reasons. So now we have a reason for a paradigm change. And in much the same way as Planck, Einstein, Bohr, Heisenberg, and so on, did not really know what they are up to. And Planck refused the idea of quantum physics, and Einstein refused the quantum physics, and did not even like his own theory of relativity, the expansion of the universe, and so on. We don't know really what we are doing, except that I think we have the urgent need for a paradigm change, and this is what I think all of us are trying somehow to come up together in the process of that. We have a need, and this is what this course is, that there should be much more discussion among various disciplines and the need of transdisciplinarity and so on. Because basically, any technology is sociology, because it comes back to the human being. Any part of physics is deeply connected with economy in one way or another. And of course, economy, on the other hand, cannot live without physics. So these are these questions about the new paradigm discussion. Will be with us, whether we will do something or not. It's another story. Go on, please, Sally.
Well, thank you, because this helped me understand what you're all about. And I sympathize very much. But since we now have an economist who is giving the main talk today, and since you touched upon the distributional problems, the increasing inequality, basic economic inequality, would you have any comments on this sort of Piketty debate?
Yeah.
Because doesn't he, I mean, it connects to some of your discussion, because you mentioned the notion of war. Yeah. And it seemed, I am one of the thousands who has bought his book, but I haven't read it, and again, it makes me one of the thousands something, because most of us, he hasn't read it all. But he just seemed to sort of hang part of his argumentation on the impact of the Second World War. So there was a period, I understand, according to his interpretation, after the Second World War, when we had a decline in economic inequality in most, at least Western world. And that was kind of an exceptional period. So after that, we had the Great U-turn, as the American François Nelson and his colleagues, they wrote about this in the year 2000, so it's not like Piketty is coming up with something. But would you have any comments?
I think there's two types of inequity that we have to think about. One is the global inequity, where we share a planet with, 7 billion of us. 80% of the world has 20% of the economic assets, 20% of the world has 80% of the assets. So there is, I think, a broader question of sharing that has to do with what our relationship is with the poor world, which is not something he dealt with. My own sense is that, as you say, he talks, as I recall, about the 50s and 60s when there wasn't quite disparities. Disparities, in my view, have arisen through the deregulation of the financial marketplace, which have allowed things that we couldn't have dreamt of. And we seem to have gone back about 300 years, the times of a very different time where we had these huge disparities. These disparities may be less important in an economic sense. At the end of the day, it's only 0.01% of the population has a large amount of money. But I do think they're sowing the seeds of social discontent. In London, where we have freed up the marketplace and we have ridiculous kinds of excessive consumption. The worst one was when you saw 25-year-olds going to have a drink, which I think was it was the most expensive cognac you could get, poured with the most expensive champagne you could get, and then gold dust was sprinkled in, and you held it to the light and you drank it down. I think there were £5,000 a drink or something, and 25 to 30-year-olds were going on their bonuses, etc., in a city which had huge areas deprivation. That probably wasn't a big deal. If you sat back and looked at the big picture, it probably wasn't a huge deal. But I think in terms of sowing the seeds of tremendous social discontent, it is. It really is. So I think there's two types of the inequity. The second part of inequity is it's not a very economically efficient way of moving your economy forward. The broader your income distribution, the more people are going to consume, the more you're going to keep your economy moving. So I think there's an economic argument and there is a social argument on inequity. Piketty did not deal with the big inequity, which is the difference between the rich world and the poor world. And if we don't deal with that one, then the social tension will be significantly larger in my view. If we really don't get incomes moving in Africa, we will all pay the heavy price of that in the next 20 or 30 years. China and India are beginning to make progress, but Africa is still way behind on that. So I see that as the big inequity question rather than the smaller ones. But the smaller ones can sow the seeds of social discontent as they will in Spain, Italy, and maybe in England.
Following what Ian said, Piketty now, of course, is a big name, and just like you, I bought the book. Just like you, I am whatever on the 50th page, and still is a long way to go. But besides him, there is a lot of literature on that aspect. There is a group from the United States, I think Saleh Martin, basically, obviously not from the States, but somewhere else. He really is a proponent of this theory that tide lifts all the boats, and therefore it doesn't matter if it will all be good. There is another one, by name Branko Milanovic. He's not the Prime Minister of Croatia, but he's a colleague of you, he's working in a World Bank, who has studied also this question of inequality. And there is a simple book which I read by two MDs, British MD, describing the correlation between inequality and a number of socioeconomic indicators showing that the largest inequality, the bigger the crime, the lower the life expectancy, and the number of other things. Now again, with all of these measurements we discussed 2 days ago, the question of measurement. Measurement is a very tricky thing. So far we know meters, seconds, and things like that. The measurement in economy is, I would say, if you I don't know whether you agree or not, but I would say it almost is beyond what we can meaningfully do now, because obviously GDP is not a good way. We don't know how to translate various things into something that can be measured. You know, we always measure things, money and so on, but that is all. So it's a very, very, very tough thing, but definitely the call is encourage all of you to read Piketty, and all of this literature is certainly very important.
You know, a kind of controversy over
yes.
But just to give you a sense of this, why I think we have got to rethink. In my own country, there's a study done a few years ago, which basically ran economic models more or less as they were, and came to the following conclusion, and it's approximately that by the middle of the century, half the people could be employed full-time, or everybody could be employed half-time, but they couldn't figure out how everybody could have a meaningful job full-time. That is sowing the seeds of either a dramatic redistribution, because you suddenly have to tax half the people to pay for the safety net for the other half, or it's a recalibration of the human condition and how we think about our lives, or it's a recipe for social disruption. And whichever one we don't quite know. But it seems to me that if we don't try to get a handle on some of those issues, particularly in my view the labour issue, the social crisis will hit us long before the climate change crisis, in my view, long before. And we're not that far from tipping points on the social crisis with the 25-30% unemployment of graduates in Spain. I think if we don't get a handle on redistribution with growth or jobs with growth, we will frankly run into a very rapid dead end, and that's going to be a major issue.
So can you comment on the problem of global debt and its facilitation of global equality?
And then Corona. Okay, so go ahead. And then Gary, and then you can answer to all of that.
Similar question. You mentioned that somehow, if I understood you, that these new financial instruments and products are something which is in the ether. So do we have the instruments to measure that, or the similarity with that? What is the meaning of that? You will understand that because you know in physics, the history of physics, whenever there was something which was not good understood, it was told that it's the ether. That will disappear somewhere somehow. So similar to me is your sentence that all these instruments today are in the ether. What is the meaning of that? Similar like what is that?
Well, a lot of the debt is not in the ether. It's real debt owed to countries because they borrowed from commercial and non-commercial sources. My own view is that we did a lot at the turn of the millennium when there was some debt write-offs, but it didn't go deep enough. And I think that in a sense, we almost have to come to grips with a clean sheet, a blank sheet. And I think that we will see another round, particularly for Africa, of some form of larger global debt, or some sort of major debt.
Perkins' book, The Confessions of an Economic Hitman?
No.
Well, these are detailed stories of how places are in debt. Yeah. And he was a significant player in negotiating things like getting, he was the Philippines to build a vastly expensive nuclear power plant at the foot of the volcano, a plant that never been put into operation. But the debt was massive.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of this debt has been used. A lot of the debt has been used correctly for growth and for wealth creation, and a lot hasn't. And I think that it takes two to make a mistake. And I think the debtors have made a mistake, but those providing the funding have also. I think one big issue for the next number of years will it precisely be indebtedness related to nuclear power. You have a kind of path dependency in the nuclear energy industry that you need a certain number of plants every year to keep your business going. Well, the EDF found this, and the French found this very much so. And now with the growth of nuclear power plants in the world, you can almost guarantee that there'll be non-fungible resources sent to developing countries in the next 20 years for nuclear power. You can guarantee it. And by non-fungible, I mean you get the money if you buy nuclear power plants, but you don't get the money if you don't. And I think that will be one element of the debt, but only one element. But I do think there will have to be, in the next number of years, some form of debt write-down again. I could see it coming. Because we're not changing our economic model. I mean, we're actually, we're doing it domestically as well as internationally. We jokingly said, I think once in an article that, the British government, it looks at to see whether economic growth, economic wealth is taking off. It looks at the high street, and are more and more people who don't have money buying more and more goods they don't need with money they don't have. And that's what stimulates a new paradigm of growth. And that's what we have to cut that, it seems to me.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ian. I thoroughly enjoyed this. I've heard you many times as we've talked about these issues. I'd like to just touch two issues that we have discussed in the past. You mentioned the idea of this Newtonian concept of social science, particularly as it applied to economics. And I think it's really important in reviewing the existing paradigm to see how much it is based on the idea that this is the way it has to be. This is the way it has to work. In fact, our exercise this afternoon in the next session will really be to look at many of these assumptions, to try to highlight some of the assumptions that are implicit in the present system. Ivo, usually when he talks about new paradigm, he reminds us always at the beginning that a new paradigm doesn't mean we throw out everything. Relativity theory and uncertainty and quantum theory didn't throw out Newtonian physics, but it saw that Newtonian physics was posited in a specific realm of truth or reality, and there's a lot on both sides. And I think that's very true of economics today. We've been concerned very much in the academy, and not only us in the club and other places, rightly so, of the obvious failures of the present economic system, which tell us it's not just a failure of policy, it's not just a failure of institutions, but there's some fundamental flaws in the very concepts that we're working with. There's another reason for reviewing economic science, and that is not only because of the overt failures and the threat of catastrophe, but simply looking at the upside. Are we really using our opportunities to the fullest extent? And if you look at the enormous capacities we have today, capacities of knowledge, capacities of production, capacities of social organization, human capacities. I mean, the human capital that has been developed over the last 50 years through higher education and greater liberality and freedom, democracy, and so forth. We have to ask ourselves, is this really the best we can do with the resources we have? And of course, Ian, you flagged the most obvious part of that. If we've got, according to ILO, a few hundred million people unemployed, we know the real figures, if you look at underemployment, are probably closer to a few billion that are underemployed. Well, human capital, human beings not only need the benefits of the distributional benefits that come from work, they are also our most precious and perishable resource. And do we, even if we can provide for them materially, we also know that work opportunities offers a tremendous social and psychological rewards. Are we utilizing the creative capacities of human beings? Are we utilizing the technological capacities and organizational capacities that we have? We have countries that could produce all we need globally. Shortage, we don't need to have a shortage of anything today. We started economics at a time when scarcity was really a prevailing reality. Today, if we have scarcity, it's not because we lack the productive capacities to generate it. It's primarily because of the way it's organized. So I think to look at the upside, if our goal is maximizing human welfare and not just our goal of preventing
civil wars and revolutions, which is a real concern if we don't solve these problems, or having environmental catastrophe, which is a real concern. I think common sense tells us there's got to be a better system. And the fact that we haven't invented it up until now, we don't accuse Newton for having thought of relativity or quantum theory, we congratulate him. And if you look at the curve which people put up in your first morning, that shows the progress that humanity's made in the last 200 years in terms of the figure shows in spite of 7-fold growth of population, we've had a 12-fold growth of per capita income globally. I mean, this is an enormous achievement. The fact that we can't sustain that with the existing model is very important. But I think it's equally important to recognize we can do better than this if we have new concepts, or better concepts rather, and if we have the institutions and policies that support them. And we wrote about that in our first article.
I guess one thing I'm sort of coming to grips with is, I think the case for a greater theory of humanity is warranted. I keep wondering whether economics is best seen as a servant to that. In other words, a bit like engineering, that it's a means, it's a set of tools, it's a set of instruments, but it's as with an engineer, an economist is there to serve what society wants. If you want to build a bridge, you need a good engineer, but the engineer doesn't need a theory of bridges and the role they play in society. I wonder sometimes whether it's a question whether whether we might be guilty of overloading economics, even as we speak of it being non-Newtonian, as even being more than it is. And where it's at its most important is when it can answer practical questions to meet the goals that society sets for it. I think we've confused those concepts a little bit.
Karl Popper made a similar point when he said, the philosopher of science, when he said that when it comes to the natural sciences, it's very clear that the primary objective of the natural sciences is knowledge. We should know how things work and why the way they work. But he said he felt it's a mistake to apply that automatically to the social sciences. He says our greatest priority should be to affect human welfare. And so it's not a question of just understanding how our present system works. It's a question of what is the optimal system that will give the maximum benefits to society, meaning that economics can't be, the tool doesn't run itself. The tool is meant for a purpose. And so it has to be set in a larger context. And that's really what we mean. We don't need to change the fundamental, how the engines work necessarily inside, okay? How they link to the whole world.
Good. May I just, excuse me for the moment, what Marx, he says, the philosopher explains the world. Today, the philosopher should change the world.
This is the famous last poem by Mises, yes.
I just want to get back to that.
Now, can we have Gordon? She was...
Okay. I guess you raised your hands here. But no, I'm just as a follow-up on your comment. I said when you have the social scientists on board, economists and sociologists, we would complicate things a little bit. Because we would say...
Economists a lot.
Well, it's the common sociologists too, because we would be very alert to conflicts of interest. So we would think that there are not... Who are we when you talk about it is the best we can do? Right? You're talking about... I know, you're talking about humanity, and you have this kind of global idea that, it's the world, it's the whole humanity. But we would be more inclined to say, well, all right, there are, different interests are involved in every issue, more or less. And in particular, when we talk about the distribution and trade with the resources, natural or other kinds of resources, I mean, the whole idea of the market is that there is a buyer and a seller, and the economy is about how do you get the best deal, and how do you sort of find a solution when you have conflicting interests here. That could also be common interests. So I just want to sort of, I assume that when you want to isomatize what you're doing. But I think, as a social scientist, I would probably say that the one thing that needs to be addressed very carefully is who is the we here, and awareness that it's going to be complicated to get people to go along, because in the real world, people have different interests, different interest groups all over, right? Some would benefit the Western solution, which is pretty.
I think there's a real challenge, and I would say 20 years ago, the we would have been the nation state. You would have seen that as the primary organizing principle would have been the nation state in some sense. And you'd say the we would be, what do we want for country X? But in a globalized world, and an increasingly globalized world, the we is not as clear as it once was. And I think that is a challenge, and we have got to understand our values as global citizens. Do we value global citizenry or not? And I think that is a complicating factor.
But this is part of the analysis is from the resistance to activity.
Absolutely. Yes.
I wonder if this expand on what get back to that supply and demand model as an interesting aspect to it, because we can also look at it as an allocation of competence to the seller and an allocation of competence via. But what that allocation of competence could be construed as is an ability to use human capital to understand the dynamics of producing, the dynamics of buying and so on. But I think in the heart of what we're trying to do in the new morality of globalization, where the struggle to give the individual an identity and a space, is also the challenge of allocating competence to the individual in terms of human capital and the maximum use of human capital and so on. So I see there is an interesting insight that comes from the classical model, but we have to figure out a technical way to make that, if you like, a much more global dimension of normative settings. I was just reminded of one experiment that was done in Peru, the Vickers experiment, something might have heard of it, that was done by Alan Homework from Cornell and Basil, the president of our organization. In the 50s, they went into this village, and fundamentally the assumptions of the time were that you can do anything to a peasant, but there's one constant. Peasant will never change. But Holmberg gave this idea that if you could allocate competence with rational interests, why to the men and the women, something might happen. And what happened was that this village bought into the recipe that the heart of their own well-being and self-determined development lay in their ability to control agriculture, control things, control schools, and their own well-being. The only problem with it was that every other Indian community around there wanted to know what the recipe was, you see. And the big shots from big city murdered it because they thought this is the most subversive thing that could be experienced in Peru. And the government then closed it down because this was empowering the unempowered. And the consequence was that notwithstanding the closure of the residual of training generation after generation in making their own decisions, having a self-determined future, they are still one of the most prosperous of Indian villages. And I think 2 years ago, 3 of those women from that place earned PhDs in agriculture.
It's big.
You touched a very important issue we were focusing on a lot on the market areas, but we do not speak now on the governance issue. The serious problem that from the United States, we have dysfunctional Senate, we have inactive, our infrastructure is declining, big effort that finally 15 million uninsured people start getting the chance. Huge problems, the richest country, the largest economy. So I'm not talking with China, they are getting out of poverty, they're impressive, but they are producing externalities not only for them, for us, but for all of us, killing us, CO2 pollutions and so on. It's not Russia. What type of externalities they generate, I don't need to tell, but remember, the world largest environmental disasters RRC is a period. Tell you, I was there anyway, I don't wish you to come. And then, Africa, rich country, Zimbabwe. Catastrophe. Big tension in South Africa, also rich country. Rich country in resources, Libya, Egypt, all problems, with governance. So, we need to think about, is our democracy model outdated? What we need to do to improve governance? And for that reason, I would like you to really think about, in terms of improving governance, on studies supported, by the way, by the World Bank, which committed by Elinor Ostrom on polycentric structure and to deal with the collective or problems, the public goods, and this is what we need, this is why I was talking about network, because it's one of the ways, I mean, not use market as possible, and with good governance, we need to educate young generation to really take responsibility, really emphasize, and this is what is very clear, I mean, in countries in transition, no more in transition, because they are already European Union members. They embrace democracy, but they forgot about the other side of democracy, responsibility. But also, if you look at the country in Europe with something like democracy, Greece, they also made the same mistake. They didn't build the institutions to be responsible, collect taxes, to save energy. They wasted most of the assistance they got, for rebuilding and, for the accession. Governance issue. The democratic country. I mean, this is actually what we need to do. The voting is not enough. We need to get back. To keep institutions working, we need to invest. People do not remember. I say, voting is not. The institutions are, request participation and keeping them alive, and not just reaping off the profits of them. So I think that we need to speak more about governance and teach more about governance and about responsibilities, and starting from the kindergarten on this. Because even if we will have a perfect market, we will not improve the governance, we will be cuts. Thank you.
Thank you. Of course, the governance is one of the central issues. Let me just, of course, coming back to what Bruno said, the famous 18 pieces on Feuerbach, just to those of you who may not know, and I apologize for those who know it very well, Marx wrote it actually before he wrote not only Das Kapital, but even before he wrote the Communist Manifesto. He was quite young when he wrote that. And it is really a revolutionary, very nice phrase, except that this one really shows something else. World obviously did not want to wait for philosophers. World tremendously changed from the time of Marx, and if Marx would come now, he would not recognize this world. And this is the situation. The world has changed. So when we speak about the governance, we don't have to really change, it's not a revolution. We have to really adapt for the new world. This is totally new ball game, and this modest beginning of the course, in a way, is an attempt to really start discussing some of these things from various stories. So what I would like to do now, after giving words to Carl, to say a few words, to ask Gary to give us an overview of what we have been doing, particularly because of one good reason. Today, Gun, Krono, and I are here tomorrow all three of us are doing some administrative decision-making governance on a level of the IUC. And of course, since IUC is something that is part of us, we are vitally interested that there are people who will make decision and somebody who would applaud to them, you know. So the only chance that we have the benefit of hearing what is that we now, after Carl, have Gary. So Carl, please.
Just to add on what you said, I think interestingly we also experience this. You know, I mean, democracy is super, you know, I mean, but it's flawed. And it doesn't really properly work, you know, partly it's because actually it's controlled by interest groups and politicians don't decide, but they are pushed and shown when they move with the power, and so on and so on. And effectively we come to a situation where the stalemate that you have politically, for example, in the United States, you have in many countries. You know, in many countries, you can't move back and you can't move forward because you've got those kind of parties who never agree. It seems that humanity is not able to take a bold step forward into the right direction. That's why we also come to the conclusion that things somehow do not change. You know, I mean, like the problems that we are facing, we don't really see. We know theoretically where the solutions are, but we don't have a clue how we practically move there. And I think the same thing is basically also the feeling that normal people have, not only the intellectual. And as a consequence, I think we are already very much on the way to authoritarian systems, to a more authoritarian kind of a definition of what democracy is, to more authoritarian measures. And one of the aspects of it is, of course, all the right-wing parties that you get. And this is a result of the insecurity that the people feel. And that again results actually that democracy is a holy cow and you can't really sort of criticize it and try to improve it.
Before giving floor to Gary, let me do two things. One is, just in much the same way as I feel always more and more that Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Marx were much more clever than we now appreciate and basically don't understand them. So the founding fathers, to be very correct, of the American democracy were much more democratic than democracy that we have today. They really did not mean this jamboree of elections, this tremendous influence of lobbying and so on. Madison wrote about the importance of checks and balances. And that is the essence of democracy. The election process and so on is really a sort of just, one thing that Ian said, and I want to stress that it's extremely important. These things are mechanisms, are not the essential philosophy. Market is useful for certain things, not for everything. We fall into the trap of putting this into ideology as being very important. No, the only ideology we have is a selfish one, and this is our own survival. This is the basic thing. We have to survive, and we want to survive well. And that is all what we want. I mean, we don't want, market. Okay, market. If anything else, we do this. So the second thing I wanted to do is to have another big applause for an excellent presentation.